Ted Cruz got a rough reception from a protester while he was campaigning in the Bronx. He has an uphill battle as he looks ahead to the New York primary on April 19th. But he's still riding high off his big win in Wisconsin earlier this week. And the anti-Trump vote in the Republican Party appears to be coalescing around him. Cruz even made the cover of Time magazine's April edition. His recent successes may have increased the prospect of a contested Republican convention in July. We want to take a closer look at the state of the race for the Republicans and the Democrats. Joining me now is Paul Brandis of West Wing Reports. He's in Clearwater Beach, Florida. And Louisa Savage of Politico joins us from our Washington studio. Hello to you both. All right.
Good morning, Andrew.
Good morning. So let's start with the Republican race. Paul, Ted Cruz seems to have the momentum coming out of Wisconsin. Can he stop Donald Trump?
Well, in terms of preventing him from getting that 1,237 delegates that he needs to win the nomination, I do not think that Trump at this point is going to get there. He will need about 70% of all remaining delegates from this point, Andrew. I think the math is simply too daunting. That being said, Cruz is not going to get the 1,237 he needs either. I think the vast majority of Republican operatives are now resigned to the fact that we are clearly headed for what's called a brokered convention in Cleveland, where anything can happen. The rules are still being written. So no, I don't think Trump is going to get there. I don't think Cruz is going to get there either. So we're headed for quite a circus, I think, in Cleveland.
What do you think, Louisa, that Trump has sort of taken a few days off the campaign? He's changed some staff. Is this a sign that Trump is starting to feel that he actually might be in trouble in terms of clinching that nomination that seemed to be his for the taking just weeks ago?
Well, I think there is some recognition inside the Trump campaign that they've focused on, some of these big states, but they've left a lot of the organizing to Cruz, and Cruz has been really good about picking off delegates in states where, for example, they don't have a primary, but they have a convention instead. All those places where you have to be paying attention to the nitty-gritty rules and the way things work on the ground, and that's where long-term experience in politics really helps you. So they're trying to shake things up within their own organization and really get serious. They think that there is a chance that they might get that 1,237, but a good chance that they won't. So they're pulling out the stops now. And
so, Paul, if we really are headed towards a brokered convention, you talk about how the rules are still being written. I don't want to be a cynic here, but don't you think the Republican Party is going to try and make those rules so that Donald Trump can't win at that brokered convention?
Well, everybody is lawyering up, and Trump this week has taken to Twitter to complain about how unfair he's being treated and how he thinks, well, look, if I go to Cleveland with the most delegates, which appears to be probably the likelihood here, isn't that good enough, and should that be enough to win the delegates? I would simply point to history and say there was another guy who went to his party's convention many years ago who did not have the majority of delegates. Either he respected the rules, understood. So what did he do? He got down to work and won after several ballots. He didn't complain. He just worked hard. And that nominee, Abraham Lincoln, went on to win the presidency. I don't think that Donald Trump is any Abraham Lincoln here. He should respect the rules as they are, stop whining. And to Louisa's point, he has to have a much better organization. He has to lawyer up just as all the others have done and start fighting for these delegates instead of complaining like he seems to do.
So, if the anti-Trump forces seem to be coalescing around Ted Cruz, could that be a problem for the Republican Party? He's not necessarily the candidate they would want either.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah. Sorry.
Is that for me?
Sure. Either of you. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, Cruz is not exactly. The funny thing about Cruz and Trump is that Trump is so unpopular, so disliked, that he actually makes Ted Cruz seem almost palatable when, in fact, Ted Cruz is deeply despised by mainstream Republicans. He has no friends in the Senate. He has tons of enemies. People despise Ted Cruz. If he were to somehow get the nomination, he would be the most polarizing Republican ever to get the nomination, probably since Barry Goldwater in 1964. He was buried in a landslide that year by Lyndon Johnson. Ted Cruz is no salvation for the Republican Party either. I think they're just in a real big mess here.
Louisa?
Well, I think there's another scenario here, and there's this fever dream of some Republican operatives, which is that Ted Cruz holds Trump off from getting a nomination. This goes to a convention. There's 1 or 2 ballots of voting, and nobody comes out the clear majority winner. So what do? They nominate a third person, and the wish list for Republicans here in Washington is House Speaker Paul Ryan. They would love to see him emerge as the nominee that could unite the party and bring it back to sort of a more middle-of-the-road conservative position, not the extreme conservatism and extreme tactics of Ted Cruz, and not this sort of wild card, off-the-wall, what exactly are his views of Donald Trump. So there's definitely a dream around in this town that it'll end up being Paul Ryan, but I mean, it'll take a lot to get there.
Okay, let's move on to the Democrats. And I want to start with Bill Clinton. The former president is campaigning for his wife, and there's been a lot of buzz, about his reaction to some protesters from the Black Lives Matters movement. They were protesting his 3 strikes and you're out policy as president. Here's some of his reaction.
I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on track and sent them out in the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't. She didn't. You are defending the people who killed the lives you say matter. Tell the truth.
All right, so Louisa, what did you make of Bill Clinton's reaction there?
Well, I think there are 2 things going on here. One is that the whole country, both Republicans and Democrats, are going through this soul searching about mass incarceration, over-incarceration, and how did we get here? And this is a really difficult thing for the Clintons, because a part of the answer is, in fact, some of the laws that were brought in under Bill Clinton. And so the idea that the Black Lives Matter movement, that this whole movement for criminal justice reform, that they could turn on the Clintons, is terrifying to that campaign, because the African-American vote is such an important part of Hillary Clinton's support. So they have to be incredibly careful, and they have to really watch what they say and how they handle this issue, because it's a big one and it's a really important one to Clinton's campaign. And
the war of words is obviously really heating up between Sanders and Clinton. Let's have a listen to what Bernie Sanders said about Clinton earlier this week.
If you want to question my qualifications, let me suggest this, that maybe the American people might wonder about your qualifications, Madam Secretary, when you voted for the war in Iraq, the most disastrous foreign policy blunder in the modern history of America. People might want to wonder about your qualifications when you supported virtually every trade agreements which have cost the American worker millions of decent paying jobs.
So, Louisa, is this risky? That this campaign is obviously getting a little bit nastier between Clinton and Sanders.
It is, and she pushed back, and obviously getting surrogates to say she's the most qualified of the candidates. And so he changed his tune today and said, oh, it's not her qualifications, it's her judgment. And that is something that worked well against her with Democratic primary voters in 2008. I mean, Barack Obama made that same argument. So yes, I think we're getting to the point where this could start to be damaging to Hillary Clinton. And when she was asked to criticize Sanders, she said, no, I have nothing negative to say about him. She pulled back because she knows that if she wins, she's going to need those Sanders supporters, and she can't alienate them. So it'll be very interesting to see if this is sort of the high point, or whether they go further in attacking each other in the next few weeks.
What's your sense of that, Paul?
Well, let me come back to the this whole Bill Clinton spat real quickly. It's quite interesting. I mean, Bernie Sanders has really been getting a lot of traction with the Black Lives movement. I wonder, though, if they understand that Sanders actually voted for this 1994 crime bill that is now being so controversial. And one thing that the 1994 crime bill did was it actually helped reduce the crime rate in this country significantly. It has fallen quite sharply over the last 20 years, so much so that we can now afford to have a debate about whether it was too harsh. In fact, Sanders didn't complain 20 years ago, but he is now, because it's politically expedient. So I'm not quite sure that people understand that. The other thing about Sanders, by the way, is that he actually had a pretty tough week. I mean, after winning in Wisconsin the other day, he actually had a tough week. He gave a really bad interview to a New York newspaper where he struggled to explain his views, the consequences of his policies. It looked like he had not done his homework at all, and it really gave Clinton a big opening to say, look, this guy's been campaigning for a year. He doesn't have his policy positions well thought out. And Sanders then even contradicted himself completely the other day on Friday when he said, well, she's qualified after all, even though he said just a couple of days before that she was not. So he's really just doing himself, I think, a fair bit of damage. And in terms of delegates, by the way, he's still not gaining much ground. He won Wyoming last night. Guess who won the most delegates? Hillary Clinton did. So, again, the math against him is still daunting no matter how much traction people think he seems to have.
Paul, Louisa, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Paul Brandis of the West Wing reports in Clearwater Beach, Florida, and Louisa Savage of Politico in Washington.